Welcome into the ArtGibbs Sports Business Podcast. Here we are driving through January, and I'm being told that Texas paid $19 million to get Tom Herman in 2016, and now is paying $24 million to get rid of Tom Herman. And that doesn't include his salary. Let's dive into that. So, according to Hook'em.com and Brian Davies, in 2016, it cost Texas $19 million to get rid of Charlie Strong. $10.2 million of that went to Charlie Strong to buy out his contract. He had a guaranteed contract. $6.2 million went to buy out his assistant pool, and $2.5 million went to Houston to buy out Tom Herman from his contract at Houston. Now, at the time, that made sense. You know, Tom Herman was the bee's knees in college athletics. He had just been with Houston. He had just led Houston to beat number 9 Florida State in the Peach Bowl. He had done amazing things, and he was the guy. They wanted Tom Herman. They flirted with the idea of Nick Saban, but that was probably only a few donors who thought that would happen, and they went with Tom Herman. Now, that's a lot of money to pay, but Texas is pretty unique. Now, many people may know this, but Texas is the most profitable, biggest, most highly valuable college football brand. Wall Street Journal valued them at number 1 at $1.1 billion, and that was just last year. Now, of course, the success of Clemson, the success of Alabama, the success of Ohio State has been far greater than that of Texas on the field, of course. But Texas has its Longhorn Network. It has major donors, which we're going to talk about in a second, and it's still valued at $1.1 billion. It's obviously within the Big 12, the most teams counted as rivals. We discussed that with Dr. Coda Havard on an earlier podcast. It is a very valuable brand and very valuable team. Now, this 19 and 24 million, where is that money coming from? So the teams like Texas, like Tennessee, like Notre Dame, these top teams in terms of profitability, they're self-sufficient in terms of money that they use. They use money that they generate, private money, usually from donors, and then money from ticket sales, etc., TV contracts, usually funds that program. You're not using taxpayer money even in these public universities for these college football programs. And of course, if you really look into the details of what even the school pays a coach, it's not going to be the full salary. So let's say that Nick Saban's paid $9 million to coach Alabama. That's what he's paid to coach Alabama. Now, Alabama is not even paying him, or the Alabama football program is not even paying him the $9 million. They might pay him $4 million, $5 million. Then the other money is going to come from other avenues. So it could be appearance money. It could, and it could come from these various donors and private companies that support Alabama football. It's the same with Texas, etc. So even in these buyouts, and we saw it with Auburn, we're seeing it with Texas, these buyouts are generally driven by a few donors in terms of the funding of the buyout. Now, probably they're driven by the few donors in terms of making the decision to do the buyout, but again, they're footing the bill. So let's just look a little bit at Texas, the football program itself from a revenue kind of earnings perspective. So Texas in 2018 had revenue of $168.9 million. Again, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, I believe. And this is the most of any school, any football program. According to that Hook'em.com, they in 2014, 2015, and again, I know these numbers are kind of all over the place, but it gives you an idea. They produced $95 million in earnings, basically for the program. So you're talking 160, 170 million, 95 million production. Now, of course, this year was COVID, and many people even within the athletic department were asked to take pay cuts. And according to a couple news sources, even Tom Herman took a pay cut. Now, we'll go back to talk about these donors a little bit. So there's a great article in the Wall Street Journal in 2009, talking about the donors. So the donors, 2009, kind of like this year with COVID, was a recession year. And of course, W.A. Tex Moncrief said, "We're in damn good shape," was his quote. And were fine as donors. And even in that year when everybody was kind of having a reduction in revenue, Texas revenue went up almost 20%, much of that driven by donor contributions. So again, even in a recession, some of these, very high-end donors are kind of recession-proof. And additionally, in that Wall Street Journal article from 2009, they talk about how Texas has many mega donors. So most schools will have a couple mega donors, like you've got Lex Wexner at Ohio State. You've got Paul Bear Bryant. I don't know if you call him Bear. Paul Bryant Jr. at Alabama. But at Texas, you've got several. So we're going to run through them real quick. At Texas, you got Red McCombs. Red McCombs, of course, was not a fan of hiring Charlie Strong. He's a billionaire. He used to own the Minnesota Vikings, was a part owner in the Spurs. He said that Charlie Strong being hired was like a slap in the face, and that he believed that Charlie Strong could be a great assistant, but that he couldn't be a coach at Texas. Then we've got Robert Rowling, a veteran of the oil industry, then headed up Gold's Gym and Omni Hotels. We've got W.A. Tex Moncrief, who I mentioned earlier, an oil and gas exploration, kind of a wildcatter. He's literally 100 years old and still going. A lot of these guys are. Joe Jamail, unfortunately, is not around, but he was a large donor as well. Joe Jamail, of course, the king of torts, and torts are just crimes against, from one person to another, etc. And he got the big Texaco Pennzoil settlement, $10 billion, and wrote a fabulous book called My Trials and Jubilations, which I've read. It's really good. And the stadium is actually named after him. And when, as an example of kind of working with these donors or these boosters, when Mac Brown was hired, the athletic director said, "Hey, you better call Joe Jamail. His name's on the field, and get his blessing." So Mac Brown called him, got his blessing, and that helps. That helps smooth things over. That apparently was one of the issues with Tom Herman, is that he was not good with the donors, and a bit of a football coach, which Texas might need more than. And again, and we've heard many reports about this, but even Mac Brown just calling donors at various times. So he called W.A. Moncrief, and he was like, well, he just called me out of the blue, and just to say hi, just to kind of pass the time and talk football a little bit, which helps. Now, these same donors, of course, without Joe Jamail, these same donors are going to foot the bill on Herman. So Herman's going to be paid $24 million, Texas football and Texas football's donor class is going to pay $24 million to move on from Tom Herman. He had a guaranteed contract, of which he had 3 years still on the deal. He was making roughly $5 million with some elevators that went to $6 million, and they're going to have to pay about $15.4 million to buy him out of those 3 remaining years on the deal. And then the remaining, let me make sure I get this right. Then the remaining almost $9 million is going to go to buy out the assistant pool. We don't have details on Steve Sarkisian's contract yet, but there are estimates that it will be, again, between $4 and $6 million. That's kind of what the job pays, and then there'll be some probably risers and elevators within that contract. So we'll see how it goes. Again, Texas is the most valuable football program, the highest revenue football program. Again, kind of like the Dallas Cowboys in the NFL, it's not totally based on their performance on the field. And I think that's something that they want to change going forward, potentially. And that's why they've made this move. Only 4 years, roughly, after making the previous move. And we'll see how it goes. Thank you for listening.